All right, shall we open our Bibles this morning to Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1? You that are in the overflow room this morning, keep praying for that building to start. We miss you over here. This morning we want to continue Solomon's journal. We call it the book of Ecclesiastes. It's from the Greek word. The Hebrew word koheleth means seeker or preacher. But it is written of Solomon at a time in his life when he had turned from the Lord and from the God that he knew as a young man, and the God who had so greatly blessed him with wisdom and wealth, wiser than any man who had lived. But his wives that he had married began to turn his heart away from God, and through disobedience and through walking away, Solomon went on a quest later on in life to try to find life in the world. He terms it under the sun or under heaven. And he tries to use all of his resources that he has of power and of wealth and all, but he sets aside the wisdom of God. And so this is his observation book, if you will. This is his notebook. These are his experiences. These are the questions he asked. These are the temporary and ultimately in chapter 12, the final or permanent conclusions he derived from his quest. We read this morning's text, and you might have recognized the words as lyrics from a rather famous song. It was written by Pete Seeger, actually, in the late 50s, the music was. I think the Byrds, those of you that remember them, you're really old, wrote it in 1965, I think, right? When David Crosby was still with the band. That's what I've read, anyway. But this is more than a quaint song to Solomon. He's the Koheleth. He is the fellow who has been observing life and seeking purpose without God being involved. And we told you in chapter 2, verse 12, I think last week, that early on Solomon had gone learning by experience. He had just jumped into everything, gaining, building, owning, possessing, having. But now, in chapter 2, verse 12, he said, well, maybe I could just learn through observation. After all, I'm a smart man. I can look and draw conclusions. And so this is part of that portion of the book where Solomon is looking, if you will, at life, seeking to find purpose in it. And notice he speaks in the first 8 verses about the experiences of life. In verse 9, he questions what profit is there in all of that. And in verse 10 and 11, correctly tells us that God intends us to experience life to the point where it will drive us to himself, and he can make the experience beautiful in its time because God has made man uniquely. He has put eternity in our hearts. As we read through this morning, you might have noticed the repeated word time. It's there 30 times because we are indeed creatures of time, aren't we? Time constraints. It is always with us. It influences us constantly. We're aware that time is passing. There's no way to stop it. Time marches on. We hear it waits for no man. Queen Elizabeth, before she died in 1603, Queen Elizabeth I, there's many of them, said that she would give up all of her possessions for just one more minute of time. She wanted to retrieve it. But it is fleeting. You can't own time. Once you lose it, you can't recover it. We're aware of time. Herbert Spencer wrote, time is something that we kill all of our lives, and in the end it kills us. But that's how we live. You know, the earth rotates on its axis, and some 365 times a year. We call that a year, and we live each cycle from sunrise to sundown, and then the next day, and we break those days up into 24-hour segments so we can track those, and then we put every one of those hours into 60 minutes so we can watch that, and then we got 60 seconds in a minute, and now they're nanoseconds, in science, and everybody's realized that, man, time is flying by. We keep calendars, we have date books, we have planners. Every now and again, we'll hear one of your phones go off to remind you how important you are. There's a timer on there, too. Tell you what to do and when to do it. We have watches on our arms, most of us. We set alarms just so that we can be on time. If you're at church up here in the morning, you realize that's not true for everyone. Went looking for some studies that they might have recently done about how much time a 70-year-old man has spent doing things. I thought it was quite interesting. I found several of them, and a lot of them agreed in pretty close proximity, so I wrote some of them down. It says that if you live to be 70, you'll have spent 6 months sitting at a stoplight. I know. I think I've already done that. You will spend 8 months of your life opening junk mail. Is that accurate? I don't know. Could just be a time killer in someone's college dissertation. It said in the report that you will spend 1 year of your life looking for misplaced objects. Some of you more than others. 2 years unsuccessfully looking to return phone calls and email messages. 4 years of doing housework. 5 years of waiting in line. I know. Almost 7 years of doing nothing but eating. Not all at once, that's over the grazers. 23 years you will have slept. 20 years you will have gone to work. 10 years you will have spent time just recreating. 2 years just getting dressed. 4 years being sick. 5 months tying your shoes. Loafers. Big time saver. Just telling you. You get all kinds of help here. Time's very elusive. It depends on how old you are as to how you relate to time. When I was a young boy, I think 9th grade, and we had the summer vacation, I honestly swore it lasted forever. We don't have to go back for months. And it was just that, months. It was so cool. Time just seemed to crawl by when you're young. And then you get a little older. Time starts to walk. Then time starts to run. Pretty soon time's flying by. At a meeting with our staff the other day and planning some of our Easter stuff. We just did Easter. Somebody pulled out the wrong folder. I'm sure of it, Now we're at it again. When you get older, time goes fast. And when you begin to think in those terms like Solomon as he was observing life, you want to make sure that every minute counts because there aren't that many of them. I heard of a story of a fellow who went to the doctor for a physical, and he went home, and next week the doctor called him. He said, "Well, I got some bad news for you and have worse news. What would you like to hear first?" And he said, "Well, I'd like the bad news." He said, "Well, you're going to die in 24 hours. "Oh. And the worst news? I meant to call you yesterday." Time. Moses wrote in Psalm 90, "Teach us to number our days, Lord, so that we can gain a heart of wisdom." So how can you make wise use of the allotted time? And we will learn from verse 11, when we get to the end of it here in a little bit, that there is an eternity involved. And if eternity is involved in this time, then this time is worth living. But if that escapes you and all you have is this time, you're going to end up with nothing but judgment. You have to be able to appropriate eternity because you and I are stuck between time and eternity. To everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under heaven. There's that phrase again, Solomon out looking horizontally. A time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to pluck what is planted, a time to kill, and a time to heal, a time to break down, and a time to build up, a time to weep, and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones, and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to gain, a time to lose, a time to keep, a time to throw away, a time to tear, a time to sow, a time to keep silence, and a time to speak, a time to love, a time to hate, a time of war, a time of peace. Solomon, in looking at life under the sun, makes these observations, and he gives us 28 of life's activities, things that consume much of our lives. 14 positive, 14 negative. set in juxtaposition to one another, so that if you just read them, you almost come to the conclusion, well, they just kind of cancel each other out, don't they? It is Hebrew parallelism, Hebrew poetry, rather than having words rhyme, have thoughts rhyme, or stand in juxtaposition, if you will, or contrast to one another. It's called antithetical parallelism. You just take two opposite sides so that you can learn the truth from both. And here you get these 14 sets of contrasting ideas under heaven. Because to Solomon, this is what he observed. Life is like this. This is what life of the earth is made of. That's the stuff that you find in the world. This is what he saw. There was a time to be born. There was a time to die. This minute, 358 little children will be born. This minute, 208 people will find out this is their time to die. To God, it is a specific. There is a time for each one of us to be born. There is a time for each one of us to die, and the balance is there. There's life and death. And Solomon, in watching it, notices in verse 9, what good is it when everyone goes through the same things and watches this kind of balance of life take place? Our birth and death is not an accident. It is an appointment by God. Now, only the believers know that and see that and can find comfort in that, but none of you chose when you were to be born. There was no pre-womb call, you know. I think I'll be born on a Tuesday. You had nothing to do with it. You will have nothing to do with how your life ends unless you seek to trespass God's area of oversight. In Hebrews chapter 9, Paul wrote, it is appointed unto men once to die. God has made an appointment for you. Then the judgment. David wrote in Psalm 139, your eyes, Lord, saw my substance, though they are yet unformed, and in your book all of them are written, the days that you have fashioned for me, even though as yet there are none of them. God has a plan. It's God's way, isn't it? You live, you die. Now, you cannot choose the day you are born or the day that you die, but you can choose the day that you're born again. Jesus said to get to heaven, you had to have a spiritual birth, and that came by making a decision both about you and your sinfulness and him and his deity and his sacrifice and the purpose for them. So you can do that. You can do that today. You can do that any day. Maybe today is your day that you will admit to God that you are a sinner and you thank the Lord for sending his only begotten Son to die for your sins. And you embrace his work rather than your own. Born twice, die once, physically. Born once, not spiritually, die twice. You'll die here and you'll have judgment with God for eternity. Time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to pluck up what is planted. Now, those are farming terms, but we relate to that, don't we? I mean, even those of you that don't have green thumbs know that there's a proper time to plant stuff and a bad time to plant. Nobody goes out in a snowstorm and say, I think I'll just plant some seeds today. No one goes out to cut apples off a tree while they're not apples yet, you know. We understand and we cooperate with the seasons that God has set before us. And so, you know, there's a time for both. There's a time to put seed in the ground. There's a time to dig stuff up and start over, to replant, to pull down, to plow over. We read in verse 3 that there's a time to kill and there's a time to heal. Now that bothers some people, but, you know, to the Jews, you know, capital punishment was really a part of their law. And there did come times when there was a proper time to bring and pass judgment and to care for the nation by applying the law of God. It was found in their law. But the opposite was also true. There were times to reach out and heal and deliver and make new and start again, to get another chance. And Solomon recognized that as he looked at the world under heaven, under the sun. You know, every cell in your body replaces itself every 7 years. Every 7 years, it's a new you. Well, all right, except for brain cells. That doesn't work with brain cells. Those just die. But you're physiologically, you can replace your body every 7 years. And the cool news is the memory that were in the old cells are still related to you in the new cells. There's a time to kill, a time to heal. A time we read to break down and a time to build up. demolition always followed by construction, right? If you've driven around the city over the years long enough, you realize that most cities, to be sure that the funding that the federal government gives them, and it has to be used in the year that it is funded, start in September to do building projects, right about Christmas when you're trying to get to the mall, right? Every lane is closed but one. But they'll do it because they want to get the money that has been allocated to them, and so now all of a sudden becomes building time. But often to build, you got to tear down the old. You got to replace it, and this infrastructure, urban renewal thing, you can watch. Solomon was right. There's a time to build and a time to tear it down. You can see it in your body as well. When you're young, you grow. Your muscles get bigger, your bones stretch. Everything just says life. You feel it. You look good. And then you hit some kind of a level where everything stops and you begin to head in the other direction. You actually get shorter as you get older. Your discs compress. You shrink. Your bones weaken. You could really describe the older part of life as just shriveling away, but no one does. You're at your peak at 19 to 22. After that, it is all downhill from there. Imperceptibly at first, but you'll notice the older you get, the steeper that hill becomes. Words on the page get smaller. Stairway steps get taller. Distance to the mailbox from the porch, insurmountable. People's voices get softer. And there goes your ambition and your metabolism and your drive. Time to break down, time to build up. Just don't break down before you build up. When I was a young man, I think I could eat 10 times my body weight and never gain an ounce. I love those days. When going to a buffet meant something. Now, if I drink a glass of water and just look at a picture of a donut, I can gain 10 pounds. Verse 4 says there's a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. Now, there's a lot of emotions there, but God has given us a wide range of them to handle a wide range of life's experiences. There are some muscles in your face that only work when you smile. They're really not good for anything else. And some of you need to use them more. It's a good thing to smile, to laugh. It's not good to just store it all in. Laughing releases tension and relaxes tissue. There's a time for it, but there's also a time for weeping. And Solomon's just added it all up. Man, he's watching. There's good times and not. There's happy times and sad. I remember being told by my dad as a young boy that big boys don't cry. Well, that wasn't true. Big boys cry. Old boys cry. Young boys cry. Those lacrimal glands that the Lord gave you to produce tears, they don't stop working when you get older. Now, there's an appropriate time to cry. I know there's a time for it. I'm not sure me standing up here every week in tears would help you. How are you guys? I'm not good. But there's a time for it. There's a time for mourning. There's a time for dancing. There's a time for both in our lives. Now, we would prefer the other, right? Laughing and dancing, but there's a time to it. You ever laughed at the wrong place or in the wrong time and it's just uncomfortable, just out of place? Nervous response, a way to handle stress. I spent the last 25 years as a chaplain with the police department, first with the LA Sheriff and now with Santa Ana PD. And there are some tragic places police find themselves, seeing horrors that no one should have to see. And sometimes police officers will make jokes at the worst of times. They would understand it because they're trying to handle the stress. Someone standing on the curb would not, now that everything is filmed and everything you do. But it's a great way to relieve tension. If you didn't laugh, you'd die. I remember in chemistry class in high school getting in trouble with a chemistry teacher who was a real chemistry teacher. And And he sent me to the principal's office and said I was in trouble. And I started laughing. And the warning turned into a 3-day suspension. Sometimes you just laugh at the wrong times, but there's a time for it. And Solomon saw life, man, it brings all of that forth. You know, the rain falls on the just and the unjust. There's a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. Now, that may make no sense to you initially, but if you lived in Israel or if you've been to Israel, you'll know that stones are everywhere. It is a country of rocks. The Jewish legend that they will tell you when you're there is that when the Lord handed out rocks to an angel to scatter in the earth, he tripped in Israel. You cannot plant without spending an inordinate amount of time preparing the soil by just picking up rock one after the other and carrying them to the property line. And that's the only way you'll ever plant. However, when you then need to put a wall up around to protect your property or to terrace the hills for irrigation, you'll go back and bring those same rocks back in place, and they'll become your wall and your terraces and the carriers of water. There's just a time for all of those things. To plant, to sow, to reap. We read here in verse 5, there's a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. There's a time to welcome folks, and then there's a time to say goodbye to them. Time to hold on, time to let go. Seasons of life, you know. You hang on to your kids, and at some point you got to let them go. Not a fun day necessarily, but it happens. And the only tragedy is when you as parents refuse to let them go. You have to. It's time. There's a time to gain, we read, and there's a time to lose. There's a time for profit where you move forward and you gain access and you move ahead. And then there are times to just step back, to give it up, to not have it as you once did. Maybe you changed a job and you've gone from a high position to a lowly one, or from great income to not such a great income, but you're where God wants you to be. And there's seasons of life. That's just the way life is. And Solomon, he doesn't say this with great applause, mind you. This isn't a happy song to Solomon. It's the frustration of life that he finds apart from the Lord. There's a time to keep, a time to throw it away. Some of you pack rats should underline that verse. There's a time to throw it away. I've been married 33 years. I found in my closet the other day, because we're moving a closet around, the top of our wedding cake decoration. I said to my wife, we should throw that away. She said no. So we're keeping it. I have this policy, and maybe I learned it from my father, but there is nothing at our house that I haven't used in the last year, really. If I don't use it, I just get rid of it. I hate clutter. Now, that doesn't always work. I mean, there's a time when you're fixing something, you go, I got one of those in the garage. Well, I did. And now you got to rebuy what you'd once bought. And that doesn't work so well either. But there is a time for all of those things, isn't there? To store up, to let go. Yesterday's treasure, tomorrow's garage sale. A time to tear, time to sow. There's a time when you can fix things. There's a time you just have to throw them away, to replace them. Sometimes you can sew them up. Sometimes you cannot. You got to hold on and repair. Sometimes you just have to lay them down. And then there's a time to be silent. And then there's a time to speak. Boy, we know all about that, huh? Not good, but we know about it. It's where the old foot in the mouth comes from. And then we read in verse 8, there's a time to love and hate, a time of war and peace. We in our culture sing peace songs. We usually protest war. And yet, according to the Bible, in the world, by observation, because of sin, because of man and his life, there is an appropriate time in life to hate and to have war. David, when he said to the Lord in Psalm 139 about searching his heart, he said, Lord, I hate those who hate you with a perfect hatred. When William Wilberforce was in touch with and met that former drunk named John Newton, who had written Amazing Grace, he discovered a relationship with God, and one of the first things that God did in Wilberforce's life was he brought him face to face with the British slave trade, and he wrote that he hated it, the inhumanity that he saw. And he said, I am determined to spend my life ridding Britain of slavery. And he spent his entire life at it. And in 1833, 3 days before he died, they passed a law in Britain abolishing slavery. Lincoln had kind of the same story. You know, Lincoln was the fellow who wrote of being at that New Orleans slave trade block, and he said, this won't do. This isn't right. I hate this. And I'm going to determine to do something about it. There is a time to love, and then there's a time to hate things. There's a time for peace, and then there's a time for war because of sin and man. Sometimes peace can only come through war. When dictators rise and people begin to be abused and reason is set aside, force is often necessary. And when things are corrected, peace follows for a time. Well, in all of these things, Solomon learned them through observation, the balances of life, how one comes, the other follows, 28 contrasting experiences. But what brought him to the difficulty was verse 9. He said, what profit is there in this? How is there any benefit to knowing this, to seeing this, to realizing that everything that we see, everyone goes through, one after the other? Where will it lead? Now he will ask in verse 20 and 21, we won't get there this morning, where do we get to from that? What does it get us? In verse 23 he will say, can anyone tell us what happens next? But verse 9 is the one we want to look at this morning because he wants to know, going through all of the experiences of life, what it profits. Now this is the third time Solomon in his journal has said what profit is there, literally what's left when the experience is over. What do I have when life stops? And Solomon observed the cancellation of experience, the 14 good, the 14 bad, and he came away with the net observation was 0. Right? I got nothing left. Until you get to verse 10 and in verse 11, where Solomon's conclusion is right. And for a moment, the lights shine, and the Lord gets through. He looks at life and he says of life in verse 10, I have seen that it is the God-given tasks which the sons of men are to be occupied with. In other words, I have seen that God gives this experiential life to all of us. The highs, the lows, the good times, the bad, the tears, the joy, the laugh and the mourning, the planting and the tearing down. Verse 11, for he has made everything beautiful in its time. And he has put eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find out the work that God does from the beginning to the end. Inserting the Lord, which he mentions 4 times here in one verse, Solomon comes to a conclusion that is far different than had you stopped at verse 8. It is this simple life without God that doesn't make sense. It just becomes this balancing act, right? It's cruel. Without God, according to Solomon's observation, life is a series of polar events that can only be survived by seeking to balance the bad with the good. It's time for mourning, but hey, it'll get better. We'll be laughing next week. You'll see, there'll be a new leaf, there'll be a new time. Things are going to get better. That's life in the world. We try to balance them, right? We don't really have a hope that it's leading anywhere in the world apart from God. Life is more in terms of survival than it is in times of joy. And yet, Solomon concludes wisely that, look, God gives man these things to go through so that man might look for God. Because being made with an eternal desire, whatever your experiences are in the world will not fully satisfy you. And so God uses those things in your life to get you to think about Him. And He makes then your life beautiful in its time. There's an eternity to be factored in. And when God's plans in time are acknowledged, your life becomes meaningful and blessed and purposeful. But that's going to require faith on your part because according to verse 11, God doesn't show us the whole picture all at once. You can't discover what His full purpose in any event in your life is. Why do you think God did that? I have people ask all the time, why do you think the Lord? And I usually stop them about that and say, I can't speak for Him. Because I don't know. I just know in the long run, He does all things well. He's for me and not against me. That all things work together for good to those who love the Lord. But if you want me to explain why one thing happens over another, I don't have a clue. I just know that I'm going through these things so I might be convinced that God is worth following, and in the process I learn that everything then takes on a beauty. It's not just the cancellation, it's the work of God to get me to know Him. There's great despair in verse 1 through 8. There's great cancellation, but knowing God, it all depends on your choice about Him. The answer to verse 9 is going to be dependent upon whether you're just going to stay in verses 1 through 8 or you're going to move to verses 10 and 11. Medical science can add years to your life. Jesus can add life to your years. You put God in the equation, you have a relationship with Him, you seek to know His heart, you pursue after Him in every season of life, and you will find great joy. But until you do, verse 10 is absolutely right. Life is just a task to be endured. But yet God has placed eternity in each of us so we might seek Him. And life makes sense, and there's a beauty in it when you begin to serve the Lord. And He'll take the experiences of your life, and He'll take the events in your life, and He'll make them beautiful. And the Hebrew word is appropriate or fitting. In other words, God won't waste your tears or the difficulty or your experiences. They are all intended to bring you to Him, good and bad. But you got to have faith. You have to see your situation with Him involved, because if you don't, life seems absurd, doesn't it? It is a bunch of random, meaningless circumstances. But it's kind of like trying to get the picture of the jigsaw puzzle on the table by picking up one piece and holding it right here. What is it? Isn't that beautiful? Yeah, what is it? Can't you tell? No, I'm just looking at the one piece. You stick them all in the puzzle, you go, oh, look at that. Mountains and sheep and color and sky and water, beautiful. Just don't do it. This is how we live our life a lot of times, like this. Verse 1 through 8. Time for every season under heaven. However, if I can stand with the Lord and realize that He's got a plan, there's a puzzle being put together. And the overall picture is going to be beautiful. Well, that's what God does. He takes every day of your life and He places them for good. Joseph spent 22 years in great sorrow and suffering until he discovered the plan of God in saving his family alive was Joseph himself. Beauty in your life comes when you begin to trust Him for all of the random events that don't make any sense. You'll get the picture eventually. I think it was Wiersbe who said the work of God in our lives are taking a prescription medication. If you take the chemicals separately, they'll kill you. But if you mix them together just right, they bring healing. God has put eternity, notice, in the heart of every man. Know that when you go out to share it with people in the world. There is a hunger in man that God has placed there that can't be shaken off. You know, animals are different. Animals are satisfied, and the minute they're easily satisfied, that's all they care about. When my dog wants to eat, that's it. When he's done eating, he's going back to laying around. Thank you very much. If he wants to go for a walk and he stands at the door like, are we walking or not? You can walk him around, but when he's done, I'm done. No other drive in his life. Got to go to the bathroom every now and again, got to eat quite a bit, and take me out every once in a while. That's pretty much the dog's life, you know? Man's not like that. Man's restless. He asks questions. He wants answers. God made you to ask and to wonder and to seek and to look because there's an eternity that stirs you, which is why Solomon was so restless. He'd gotten away from God. And he had this eternal hunger, which is why, by the way, every culture in every part of the world has within its cultural references immortality. It's just the way man is made. St. Augustine wrote, "Thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee." Life does have observable balances, but what purpose is there in it? We are told that they are designed by God to occupy man so that he might discover with eternity driving his heart that God can make beautiful everything in its time. Will he show you the whole picture? No. But he'll show you enough of himself to know him. I can rest. I'll never thirst again. But he's got to be your Lord. You have to have been born of his Spirit. because he made you for eternity, and stuffing the temporal things of this life constantly in your life to find satisfaction, just going to leave you empty. In fact, your life will get worse. You should spend your life on something that will outlast it. Shall we pray? Father, thank you this morning for your word, and what a great book this has been for us to study every week. And we're looking forward, Lord, to all that you're going to teach us through it as we turn the pages and go verse by verse. But help us to see, like Solomon, that the vision from the world apart from God is life is just one good after bad, one hill after valley, one cancellation after another. It's just the way of life. But the meaning of life is lost on us. What profit is there in it? The profit is that, God, you have made us with an eternal heart that longs for answers and can discover that even in the midst of all of these things, that life has been chosen by God for us to live the work for the sons of men so that we might discover you. And many of us are saved this morning because in heartbreak we looked up. And in times of great difficulty, we found proper value in life for a moment, and we considered you. And you brought us to that place of salvation. Oh God, thank you, Lord, that life isn't just haphazard. There's not just a bunch of chance that's knocking us around. You've created this life so that we might learn and turn to you for life. And then in this life we can, with great joy, live it. The highs and the lows, the ups and the downs, the good and the bad, the gain and the loss, serving you. You've appointed unto man once to die, once to be born. And in the middle, time and eternity, here we stand. Here we sit. If this morning you don't know the Lord, that's really the dangerous place to be, because what you have left is observation without hope, frustration without joy. And yet you can't be satisfied because God has made you to want to know. And this morning, you've come to church so that God might say to you, turn to my Son. In him you will find life and purpose, peace and rest. Because God sent his only begotten Son, that whosoever would believe in him wouldn't perish. He's the one we need to come to know. He's the one that the restlessness of our heart is driving us towards. And if this morning you'll agree with God about your sinfulness and his sacrifice, come talk to one of the pastors up front. You can be saved. You can be saved tonight or this morning. Today, you can come now and say yes to the Lord. That God will do. That you should do. Because you'll never find joy until you relent and you repent. Then you can rejoice. Shall we stand?